Welcome everyone on behalf of the Water Center. I am Joan Yates, so welcome. Glad you could all be here in whatever time zone you're coming from. It is the top of some hour, so glad you could all be here to our session today. Building a more equitable world using systems thinking, and that will be our focus today. And our facilitator will be our Water Center colleague, Melanie Houston. And Melanie will give you some more, yes, I saw Tracy clapping, yay, Melanie. And so I will, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Melanie and she'll give you a little bit more background on her work in this field, and then she'll just take it away because I know she has a lot for you to think about and do during this hour. So Melanie, please take it away. Thank you for agreeing to be our facilitator today. Take it away. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm so excited to spend this morning with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, perfect. And we're all seeing like a title screen right now, correct?
Yes, you are successfully sharing.
Perfect. Thank you. It's funny that we stopped to check that. So yeah, thank you all so much for spending some time with us this morning. I want us to spend some time thinking about how we can use systems thinking to build a more equitable world. Part of what I would like for us to do today is I'll share some of my experiences, and I'd love to have some time to hear from some of the things that you all are doing or some of the connections that you're seeing as well. So before we dive into the content, I want to give a little bit of background about who I am and what I'll be drawing from with regard to some of the experiences and examples that I'll be sharing today. So prior to working as a systems thinking specialist with Water Center, I was working in research at Drexel University in their School of Public Health in their Department of Community Health and Prevention. And we were using system dynamics and systems thinking to look at dynamics around structural racism and how it was affecting different maternal mortality outcomes, specifically in the Philadelphia area. And that was a role that I had part-time, and outside of that, I was also doing consulting work and some consulting work and some research as well. That was also like an example of that was the Transformative Health Justice Collaborative project that is coming out of the Florida State. And that project is also looking at how can we better understand and intervene upon the reproduction of structural racism in healthcare settings. So a lot of the work has been looking at how we can apply the systems thinking perspective to different types of systems, particularly healthcare. And I've also, outside of research, have done a lot of practice stuff, whether that was through roles that I brought in a systems thinking approach into. I've worked in higher education as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant or as a trainer in that regard. And I've also done practice-oriented projects as a consultant as well. This is an example of a picture from one of the sessions that I did with a community organization I had been working with for about 2 years on a couple of projects looking at promoting some of the health goals that they have for their community. And then I've also been teaching, and I am a adjunct faculty at Washington University in St. Louis and a faculty affiliate of the Social System Design Lab that's at the Brown School of Social Work at the Washington University in St. Louis. And I've been teaching alongside with Sarah Pritchard an Intro to System Dynamics for Advancing Equity class. And it's a weekend-long intensive class where we introduce a lot of systems thinking and system dynamics tools to help students as they're thinking about how can they approach problems in social work and public health. And I have also done a course at Drexel University for their Urban Health Collaborative, teaching public health practitioners systems thinking tools that they could use in participatory approaches. So a lot of different intentions and application areas that I'll be drawing from in the examples that I'll give today. And I would love to hear more from some of the examples that you all have had in applying systems thinking in your context, whether that's professionally or personally. I think we can all learn from each other. And so building upon that, some of my hopes for today is that one, we'll be able to invite you to consider how leveraging systems thinking can be a tool for how we can effectively manage and engage with complex problems. I also want this to be a beginning of a conversation. This will not be exhaustive at all, but I do hope that this is an opportunity for us to identify some other people that we might be able to connect with, to continue thinking through what this could look like. We also want to generate new and useful questions. So adding to the toolkit that you already have for engaging with and managing complex problems. I want this to be something that is adding into how you're already approaching it. And then I also want us to cultivate some support in trying something new. Again, adding to the toolkit of skills that you already have and resources already to address some of these challenges. This is a way for us to kind of add into that and level it up. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to hear from you at this point. And I'd like to hear a little bit from you about what comes to mind when you think about equity. And so we're going to use Slido to get some of your responses from that. And you can either scan the QR code here that is on the screen, or you can go to slido.com and enter the code. Also, I will stop sharing really quickly so that I can go over to the Slido screen. And I want to give us a couple of minutes for us to respond to this and see what some of us are thinking about when it comes to equity.
Listening skills and helping someone to be able to share their story, to feel safe enough to talk to you and to treasure what they're saying and ask the questions and all the things that we talk about.
And I'll give us a couple more minutes for some more responses to come in. But as our responses are coming up, what do you all notice about what comes to mind when we think about equity collectively? What are some things that you're noticing about this word cloud? Yeah, fairness is a common answer that was offered in the chat. And so the way the word cloud works is that the most common responses, or the responses that have a lot of multiple responses, will be bigger. So yeah, fairness is definitely one that comes up. I agree, there are a lot of positive responses as well, a lot of things that seem very hopeful, that seem aligned with a lot of desire for change. Redesigning systems and opportunity was also something that had a sizable notice with that. And so I think what we'll do, I'll kind of pause the responses right now. So thank you all for going through that and participating with that with us. And one of the things that I want us to continue doing is kind of leaning into that space of being hopeful about what equity could look like, and what it could look like for us to actually be in a space where we're working towards that actively. So I'm going to share my screen again. And one of the things that comes to mind for me when I think about equity personally is thinking about the systems thinking iceberg. Equity, when I think about it in a lot of the work that I've done, has really been highlighted to me as an opportunity for us to, like, equity as a systems problem. Like, it's an outcome of how a system is structured, the way in which we might have disparities or differences in experiences. A lot of that is really rooted in the design of a system. And so a lot of the approaches that I've taken in working with folks have been really helping us think through how can we start to see this as a system as opposed to just a bad event that happened. And One of the things that is also helpful when we're thinking about the systems thinking iceberg that supports some of what I saw and what you all also named that comes up to mind when you think of equity is that as we use like that systems thinking iceberg in perspective, and we go underneath the surface and we explore what all is there by identifying patterns of behavior, the structure of the system or the mental models, it allows us to explore and deepen our understanding of that system structure that might be responsible for generating those inequities that we're experiencing and that we want to counter. And once we've gone down the iceberg, we have an opportunity to think about how can we then leverage that system structure? How can we make changes that would actually transform the structure to allow us to have less of those inequities occurring and more of a more equitable, liberated reality for all of us. And so some of the things that are helpful to us that we know when we're thinking about using that systems thinking iceberg are the habits of a systems thinker. They really support our ability to lean into adopting that systems perspective when we're working with things. And we also have tools that help us support those different levels of the iceberg exploration. And for today, what we're going to focus on is that first level of patterns of behavior, and how a lot of the work that I've done really has been getting people to support in moving from that above the surface, focusing on events, to starting to get them to think more about what are some of the patterns of behavior, so we start to see some of our inequities as a result of a poorly designed system. We can start exploring and focusing our efforts on that. And so what we'll be talking about today are some reflections that I've had on how we've used behavior over time graphs that have been helpful for supporting that transition from above the surface to below the surface in the systems thinking iceberg. And so in case not all of us are familiar with the behavior over time graph, I'll give a little bit of an overview really quickly. So a behavior over time graph, it allows us to tell the story of how something changes over time. So it looks kind of mathy, and if you're not a fan of math, or if that's something that you try to avoid, that's okay. This is not necessarily a like very math thing that we're trying to lean into with this. Really, I see it as a communication tool, as a way for us to tell stories in a different way that allows for us to have that shared reference of how something is changing over time. And so within that, what we really want to focus on when we're telling our stories are the patterns and the trends that are really important for us understanding that story, as opposed to isolated events. And when we tell our story using the behavior over time graph, it allows us to visualize our thinking. And in doing so, it allows us to really reflect on how it is that we're perceiving, engaging with, and communicating our understandings of complexity. So it's a really simple thing in the sense that it's a line that's telling a story, but it allows us to really have some deep reflections on complexity that can be kind of hard for us to talk about just with verbally or not with visual cues like a behavior over time graph. And so some key elements of a behavior over time graph, just so we're all on the same page, because I will be referencing some of this as I go through some examples. First, one thing I always tell my students is to give it a title, put a title on it, because especially if you share it with other people, it can be hard for them to like kind of follow along with that story that you're telling. But also as you're working on it, you might forget what story you're trying to tell. So having a title at the top, and that title being whatever variable or like interesting thing you're trying to tell the story of change over time, have that there to kind of keep the story structure really well. The next piece on that horizontal line, or the x-axis, for those of us that aren't as like turned off by math, on that x-axis we're going to have time, and we always have time on that horizontal line. It can be years, it can be seasons, it can be however you're thinking about time, but it needs to be something that allows us to chronologically see how that change is happening. And then on the vertical line, or the y-axis, this is where we're going to think about how we're measuring change of that variable or that factor that we're interested in telling the story of. And this can be measured in ways that are like with numbers, with percentages. It can also be something that's more qualitative, like high, medium, low. And it can be different ways in which we structure it. But the important part is, how are we measuring? How what we choose to measure that scale allows us to tell the story of change that we want to tell. And then one of the most important pieces is that we actually want to draw that line to actually tell the story, and that describes the pattern or trend over time. And so these four elements together make the behavior over time graph, and will allow us to have that rich storytelling components with that. So part of what I've experienced in using behavior over time graphs, again, while very simple, it has been really helpful to help like leverage and lean into those habits of a systems thinker that really help promote our ability to like lean into considering equity as a systems problem. And so that allows us to interrupt how we reproduce patterns of harm and how we define and scope pattern problems and goals. It also has been beneficial, I've experienced, in how our ability to continue that focus on a system structure rather than on individual actors or like trying to blame like one person for a system problem. And it also allows us to surface and refine our mental models that allow us to imagine what transformative change can look like. And if y'all are familiar with Donnell and Meadows' work around like places to intervene in a system, if we're able to really affect those mental models, those paradigms we hold, that has the most potential for allowing for transformative change to occur. So this is a really helpful tool I've experienced for entering into that lane of transforming systems and transforming mindsets. So I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm going to give one more example and then I'm going to pause and I want to hear from you all. So one example that I've experienced a lot in some of the work that I've been doing in the DEI consulting and training space is a lot of times people would want to reach out for support when they have experienced some type of harm or some type of adverse event within their team, within their department, within their organization. And a lot of times it would be if someone had did something that was considered to be a result of implicit bias or unconscious bias, something that had happened that the team is like, oh no, like this is affecting us negatively or how we work together. And so I'm going to show you all kind of what I would do literally when I was working with folks is I would start drawing out a little behavior over time graph. I wouldn't tell them that I was drawing a behavior over time graph or introduce that language, but as I'm taking notes with folks, I would just start drawing my little x-axis and y-axis and listen to them tell the story. And as they're telling the story, I would kind of start plotting out what it is I'm hearing them say in terms of like the harm that they've experienced or like how they're understanding the impact of that harm and just kind of plotting it out. And then I'd ask them to kind of go back in time and tell me if this event that they're coming to me for has actually happened before in the past as well. And oftentimes they would say, yes, it has. And so I'd plot that as well. And they'd have like a similar explanation of like the impact that it had and what occurred. And then I'd ask them if that had happened again, and they would oftentimes say yes. And then ask them again, and they would oftentimes say yes again. And so as they would tell me that, I would kind of start to ask them to elaborate a little bit more about how did they see those events connected and start to draw little like connections to show like seems like you're in an oscillating pattern. You'd have something that would happen, you'd be able to kind of like address it, things would get a little bit better, but then the same thing would happen again. And so it sounds also like at those moments when something would happen, you'd reach out for training. And if the training happens, it doesn't seem like it's actually sustaining the change that you want to have happen over time. And I reflect back to them and ask them if this drawing that I made is correct of how they experience this pattern of harm showing up in their team dynamics. And oftentimes they would say yes. And so then I'd ask them, you know, how do we think a training would get us out of this oscillating pattern, this up and down thing? Like, do we think doing the same thing would get us out of this? And if so, that's fine. But how do we think it would help get us out of this if we do the same thing now? And so oftentimes what that would lead into me doing is developing, like helping us think about what do we want to see in the future. So I extend the thinking about what the future could look like and use that vertical dotted line to show this is today. And then again, tell the story of if we continue, if nothing changes, then we'll still have this like up and down pattern, which doesn't seem like that's what you want. And so this would be that business as usual, right? And they would agree that that would typically be what they've experienced and what honestly their fear is that they would continue having this up and down dynamic within their team. And when I asked them to explain what their hopes are for what they would like to see from the training or from any kind of intervention, it would be more like they would want to see some like decrease in the harmness experience. And they also want it to stay relatively low for a little longer than how it had been before. And they would also know that like we anticipate that something else is going to happen again, but they don't want the impact of it to be as bad as it was before. And they want to be able to rebound from it quicker and get back to that state or even a better state than they were before. So again, it's like them telling a story, me drawing and reflecting back and showing them, is this what you're also seeing? And they would agree. And so I didn't use behavior over time graphs at all with them, but it's a way for storytelling. And again, this was what they would hope for. And so we're moving, what was helpful for me in using this tool is, again, it allowed people to move away from just coming in and wanting to focus on this bad event happened and we want to do something to respond to that event, to getting them to think about how can we start shifting below the iceberg, and starting to think about what are some of those patterns over trends that we're using. And the behavior over time graph is really helpful for that initial descent into the water, if you will. And so some of the systems thinking tools that have been, our habits that have been really reinforced in that like journey below the surface, is that we surface and test assumptions in doing that. Like I'm drawing things out. A lot of times folks don't have data readily available for all the things that they care about or for the things that they've been experiencing. And sometimes I deal with this mostly in some of the research and in the teaching that I do, where that can be a little bit of a concern for folks, that it's like, how can we draw these graphs if we don't have data to support it? And I think one of the things that I found in a lot of the equity focused projects is that we don't always have data that's readily available that is reflective of the things that we care about and the things that need to be changed in order for us to actually realize a more equitable world, because not all of those things have been the interests of people who've been given the power and the resources to ask those questions, to gather that information, to track that data. It hasn't always been seen as important. And so it doesn't mean that it's not important. And the perspectives that people hold about how they're experiencing stuff that we haven't measured yet is still helpful information. It's still helpful for us to get a sense of what are the current mental models that people have. And we're expressing those mental models via the behavior over time graph. So it's still helpful for us to gather and for us to use to deepen our reflections, and for us to have those conversations about how are we experiencing inequities, what would we like to experience instead. It's also was helpful for allowing us to think about what are some of those short and long-term unintended consequences of actions that we take. Again, I'm not saying that trainings are not like helpful. They are helpful in some cases, but I think it also was helpful for the groups I was working with to think about what are some of the positive intended consequences that they want to have from some of the actions that they're taking and some of those unintended consequences, and how can we make sure that we're managing and making sure that we're minimizing some of those unintended reproductions of harm, and how we're thinking about what we're doing right now and the impact that we want to have in the future. And also for thinking about the efforts that we're putting into managing some of those unintended consequences. Are they taking away from our ability to actually do the thing that we need to do in order to really sustain that effort to promote the change that we want to see? And the last habit that, again, I think has been really helpful for this is like helping people think about structure generating behavior. Sometimes a lot of experiences I would have, people would frame it as like it's one bad actor or one bad apple in the bunch. And we would talk about how like the group composition had changed, or this might be if I was working with the student group, like the students would graduate, but they would still have the same problems within their student organizations with the folks that were left behind. So that would call us to think about, well, if the people change, but the problem persists, how is the problem the people, right? There has to be something that's persisting beyond the individuals that are in the group. It has to be something else that's more like institutionalized that might be responsible for driving that. And that, again, prompts us to think about the system structure. And so some of the questions that we would then ask, and I would also say, like, if I didn't draw a behavior over time graph with folks all the time, I would kind of make one in my head mentally, right? And kind of start to draft that out. Or if I didn't share it with folks, then it will allow me to ask some of these questions like, how do our intended course of action address the pattern we find ourselves in? What additional information could help us better understand this pattern? How have unintended consequences from our past actions been managed? Again, how does this support us reaching our goal? And then what aspects of how we organize ourselves to work together actually stabilize this pattern? So what are things that we're doing that actually keep us in this oscillating up and down thing that we don't necessarily want to address, or keep going on? So I'm going to pause here and I want to hear from you. In what ways have you experienced that, like being stuck at the tip of the iceberg in your organization or team or whatever context you're thinking about wanting to apply systems thinking to? And then what benefits do you see for kind of doing that initial descent under the water, under the surface of the iceberg? And I'll ask, we can come off mute. And I know we have a pretty large group, so maybe not everyone will get a chance to share, but I'd love to hear from a couple of folks.
Melanie, there was a question in, since it's quiet here for a second, there was a question in chat where Catherine asked, when you say unintended consequences, are you seeing these as always negative? And I responded, I think the third question on the previous slide in some ways addressed your question, I hope. And the third question on the previous slide, if you show me the previous slide, where the questions, there we go. How have unintended consequences from our past actions been managed? How does this support reaching our goal? So unintended consequences, that second part of that question, can sometimes support reaching our goal. So I think that in some ways addresses Catherine's question, I think.
Yeah, unintended consequences don't have to necessarily be negative all the time. They're just not planned for. And so it's not necessarily a value judgment on unintended. It's more, I would say like the assessment of if it's good or bad comes when we look at the impact that it has relative to what it is that we're trying to achieve. That's a good question. Any other questions if we don't have like reflections of how we see it being applied? Any other questions that are coming up for folks right now?
I can offer the thing that I'm really loving reflection wise about what you're offering in terms of using the behavior over time graphic is really the opportunity for those involved to participate in identifying the patterns, behaviors, and giving a tool for that. Because I feel like so often in the role of doing DEI work within my organization, I've been in a place more of where I'm trying to like explain this and offering like conflict as a point of connection or offer solutions, which what I'm loving about this is that has really ended up in being in a stuck place, or I feel like we're not able to move forward or just name what's happening. And what you're offering here is a way to get individuals involved in the system to actually identify the ways in which the cycle is repeating in itself and use kind of, I don't know, quasi motivational interviewing or for them to like identify the change that they want to be a part of. Because so often I feel like there's like resistance and so much like fragility because lots of times dominant culture is holding power in these systems, and you're offering to just like name what is in a way that's going to be less cause less resistance to like just shifting a pattern.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with what you just shared, Allison. And one of the things that I've also found with using systems thinking tools in general is that it provides some of this like distance between like the thing that we're talking about and like, and in a way it allows people to not get so caught up in like how like feeling like they're being blamed because we're talking about the pattern or we're talking about some type of thing that we've co-developed as a team. And then we can reflect on where do we see ourselves in that after, but it allows for people to really like listen when they're telling that story. And also what has been helpful too is like allowing people to like develop their own behavior over time graphs. I've had people use the same variable in the same time frame. So that's kind of in the same scale that we're using to measure change. And then they tell their story on that same template. And what's been really helpful when I've done that with teams is that we can see how there might be different experiences or different perceptions. And that allows us to also reflect on, well, how do we then make sense of the different experiences that folks are all having? You know, it allows us to share and tell stories in a different way. All right, great. So I'm going to move.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I could add another example if there's time.
Oh, yeah, you can share another example.
I work with a large state healthcare system, a hospital system, and they have been frustrated by what they perceive as their lack of progress in DEI work, you know, wanting to bring everyone along. And one of the tools we used to think about that was several behavior over time graphs. And they began to see some connections between high turnover rates among staff and failure to progress in their view. that it was hard to then continually have to, train new people, bring them into the culture, so to speak. And that was one aspect. And so they began to think a little bit differently about it. We're not finished, but that's the current state of things.
And Steve, you set me up perfectly for where I wanted us to go next. So I don't know if you saw my slides or not, but one of the examples that has often come up is similar to what you're describing in terms of people wanting to be intentional and think about how can we retain good people, how can we bring in more good people, how can we affect some of those dynamics that affect how our team is shaped in terms of hiring and even people leaving our team or organization. And so one of the examples that has shown up a lot, or an example that I'll use that kind of encapsulates that, is around the idea of retention and wanting to, again, maintain the same, keep good talent in. And so one of the ways, the example I'll use is when people were looking at this in terms of they noticed there was a different rate at which they were retaining white members of their team compared to underrepresented minority members of their team. And what they noticed over time is that the white folks that they had been hiring or bringing in were staying and that rate of retention was increasing. And they noticed that underrepresented minorities, even though they were bringing them in, they were leaving at higher rates. So there were less of them that were being retained overall. And again, they were thinking if this pattern persists, we'll continue to see an increase in some of the white folks that are retaining, that are staying with our organization. And that's good. That was something that they wanted. They want to, again, continue to keep good talent that's here. And they're concerned that if they continued on the pattern of having underrepresented minorities continue to leave, that again, that retention rate would continue to go down, and that's not something that they wanted. So that was a concern for them. They wanted to figure out how can we address this problem. And what they wanted to see instead was they wanted to see the rate at which the underrepresented minorities were staying on the team to go up. So this is kind of what they wanted to do, is to kind of close this gap. And I'll say that equity problems don't have to always be framed in the way of a difference between one group or another group. It can be helpful to have two different groups shown on one graph to allow us to visualize, to see what that gaps are in some ways. And that can be helpful for, again, demonstrating some of the differences, but it doesn't have to always be a comparison between two groups. And so with the retention example, this was where they were thinking that they wanted to go. And then when we talked about the fact that there is this difference and this gap that we wanted to close, one of the points that I would make is that, well, this requires us to change this line, that's going to require us to do something really different, really intentional, really focused on the underrepresented minorities, because it's a very different trend that we're trying to generate, as opposed to we just want to maintain this, right? This suggests that we need to do something different in order for this line to start to have a different trend altogether. So there might be more intentional effort that's needed, or more resources, or more something put in to come in and intervene upon and allow what we want to have be our reality to actually occur. And so when we did talk about it in that way, a lot of times people felt well, that doesn't feel fair. That doesn't feel like we're leaving out the other folks, or we're not thinking about everyone in this. We're only thinking about one group, and how is that fair to the white employees or the white staff members that we have on our team? That feels like we're leaving them out. So we should do the same thing for everyone. And what I'd ask folks, is, well, if we're doing the same thing, and this is the kind of impact that we want to have happen, that we're trying to design something that would allow for this gradual or this great of a change, are we then saying that we want this to be where we're going to with the white folks that we're trying to retain? Because again, if the scale is up 0 to 100%, how can we go above that? How can we, what are we trying to achieve? And if this is the goal, is that actually reasonable? Is it actually feasible? Is that actually what's needed right now? And why does it feel bad for us to do something that we agreed with needs to happen? And so again, that was something that would often be helpful for allowing us to visualize why there might be different needs or different resources given to different groups based upon where they're starting at and based upon where we want them to get to. And that can be helpful for kind of easing some of those concerns about well, how will other people feel? Because we have that as a shared reference to show okay, this is where we're trying to go. So there obviously needs to be a different pattern. And one of the things that I would also do in a lot of the work that I'd been doing before is bringing people in and getting the other people's perspectives. So not just talking to the organizational leaders, but also talking to like the staff members or the folks who are actually experiencing the retention and making the decision about whether they want to stay or whether they want to leave. And talking to folks, a lot of times what their concern is not the retention. Like they're not worried about the degree to which and how many people the company or the organization is able to maintain. What they're actually more interested in are the experiences that they're having within the culture. And if they're experiencing harm or if they're experiencing things like microaggressions, that's what their main focus is. And they saw that as being like a major thing for them to address, rather than being worried about how many people they're able to keep on the team. And so in telling that story of what people were experiencing in terms of the organizational culture and climate, again, the same time horizon that we're looking at for the previous example, looking at, instead of percent, the frequency of experiences that people were having, and thinking from never to always. And this is stories that people are sharing, because again, there wasn't data that was collected on organizational culture, but there was data that was collected and being maintained about retention. So another example of like, what we like have data about is often a reflection of what we care about. And again, thinking about the experiences that different people might experience based on race, the experiences that most of the white folks were having in the organizational culture was pretty like low. Pretty like okay in terms of the experiences of microaggressions in the organizational culture. There wasn't really many of those. It would happen some because we're not perfect. And again, the hope would be that we'd have an organizational culture and climate that would allow for that to happen pretty rarely, if ever, and that's the goal. For the underrepresented minorities, they felt like it was pretty consistently high, like nothing had really changed about that. And because it's persistently high, that's what's really encouraging them to like seek greener pastures elsewhere, to go to a place that would actually support what it is that they're wanting to see for themselves in terms of their growth in their career. For students, it could be around their educational support that they're needing, different examples of that. And so again, the fear that I would often hear from underrepresented minorities is, if I stay, things are going to get worse, and they don't want that for themselves. So they're actually making a decision to leave because they're wanting, again, their goal is to reduce that experience of a microaggressive organizational culture. And because it's been so persistently high, they don't have a lot of hope that it can change where they're at. And so again, thinking about how this had been helpful for like leaning us into that systems thinking iceberg is around allowing us to really reflect on some of the mental models that we hold around like what we're thinking about, around some of the things that we're using to measure and define progress. And so one of the other things that I think is really important when we're thinking about this is the accumulations and how we're paying attention to how experiences that people have had within the system is also responsible for how they're responding to whatever is happening right now. So like the past behavior of a system also affects what we're experiencing in the current and the present. And how are we thinking about that and how we're framing and defining problems and setting goals right now. And another thing about like systems that are structurally oppressive is that they're designed to affect us. They're designed to have some type of impact on us, and we're all affected by them in different ways. And so it makes sense that at some point people will want to not be affected by that, right? And so that's another accumulation to think about, is like the buildup of negative experiences that people might have had within the system, and how are we being accountable to addressing that or minimizing that. And then also one of the things that would be often really challenging is encouraging folks who are thinking about setting those goals, setting those directives for where we want to make change. How are we changing our perspectives to increase our understanding? Are we willing to, once we hear from other folks that their experience or their priority isn't a metric, but it's actually something about how we're working together, are we willing to make some space for allowing that to also be encompassed in how we're setting our goals for how we want to move forward? And a lot of times, what I've experienced is that there's this top-down approach to when we're thinking about defining what needs to change and why, and that doesn't always trickle down or is reflective of the folks who are on the ground in the field experiencing some of the harm. And so there can be a disconnect between that. And so doing some work to support teams and being able to like really be more open to changing perspectives, to reflect on how their mental models might be limiting, that has been also really helpful through using the behavior over time graphs as well. So some quick other reflections that have come up from that I mentioned throughout sharing this example is one, it helped us get really clear about our mental models around equality versus equity. It also allowed us to challenge some power dynamics around transparency, because again, with the top-down approach, a lot of times folks who are higher up on an organizational ladder don't have to explain a lot of the decisions that they're making, why, or like where all the information is coming from. And so having people draw out graphs or having people explain why the gap, why we need to make sure that we're doing something that's for everyone as opposed for some people, that again challenges people to have to answer to that in ways that they may not always have to do, which can be really helpful for, again, disrupting some of those power dynamics. It also, like I said, illustrates some of those dynamics and how problems are defined and then resourced to address them. And it can be a helpful tool for us thinking about how we might be unconsciously employing some of those harmful like belief patterns that we're trying to actually address via our equity strategies. So I'll pause here too for what's coming up for you now. Any questions that we have in the chat?
Yes, I was just going to say, you might want to look in the chat in terms of reflections. There are one question that came up that I think it was Sherry responded to, that Kelly had, could this idea and the BOTG be used on a much smaller specific scale? And Sherry answered that one for Kelly. She specifically addressed that to Kelly. And then Jean Bellinger had one. So why don't you take a second and go ahead and read what's in chat. Oops, you're muted, dear. I see your
Sorry.
lips, but yeah.
Yeah, so to the point about like, what if behavior over time graphs look different? Yes, and that's one of the reasons why I really like using them, because it allows us to tell different stories and it allows us to see where there are differences. And so if we want to then have, we have all of these different divergent perspectives on how people are experiencing things. And if we want to take away from those diverse perspectives, okay, what can we say about us as a whole, as a team, if we're trying to condense that down into like an overview of how we're performing? We have to account for those differences. We have to be able to, like, if there are folks who are experiencing, let me go back to, so if we have folks who are experiencing a lot of microaggressions, we obviously can't say that our overall culture and climate would be this pink line, right? We wouldn't be able to say that even if we haven't measured it, because we know there are some people that are experiencing a lot of microaggression. So we have to do some negotiation about how is everyone's different perspectives being brought into this collective understanding we have about how we are defining our organizational culture. And I think there was another question about if I actually have people who are at different levels within an organization doing the activities. And yeah, like we might, depending upon the different power dynamics within a team, think about, do we need to have, I've done projects where we've had people broken up by the different levels and roles that they have in an organization so that people feel comfortable sharing and they don't feel like they're at risk of like losing their job or being in any kind of way like having some type of retaliation from sharing their truth and sharing their experience. And then we can bring things together where it's not like saying this person said this, but from this workshop, this is kind of what we heard. And so there are ways to do this where you are allowing to elicit those different perspectives and also managing the risk of reproducing some of those power dynamics, stifling people's ability to be open and honest and reflective. And then for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next example that I have. These are really great questions. So I'm excited that we have questions coming up. And so the last example that I have comes from again, building on this effort to want to improve organizational culture. Again, a lot of folks in equity work that I've found are really optimistic. So that aligns with what you all shared at the beginning within your word cloud. And so I was working with one team, or not just one team, but often when I work with teams, they would feel like, especially after 2020, when in the wake of the protests and a lot of the movements around Black Lives Matter post the murder of George Floyd, there's a lot of support for doing more DEI work within their organizations. But they felt like since then, there's been less of that support for those efforts over time as people have been navigating things like COVID and like trying to figure out like economy and all this kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of reasons for why people have felt like there hasn't been as much support for organizational efforts to like improve their organizational culture. So the fear is that if this maintains, that there would be in the future, again, a decrease in the support that we have for those efforts. And so again, this would be the business as usual if nothing were to change. The hope would be that a lot of times people would share that they'd like to see them get back to having not only just like an increase, but a sustainment, like sustaining that effort that's being put in to improve organizational culture and climate. And that is helpful for people to have that shared, for people to like really coalesce around, oh, we all kind of want the same thing. Like we all have been wanting to move forward toward a place where we're sustaining something that we feel really good about and that we want to care about, but we feel like for whatever reason, we haven't been able to maintain that, or other things have gotten more priority, but we know we want to do that. And so going through that process of a group and thinking about what would you like for things to see in the future is also helpful for building some of that sense of like collective power to do something about changing the space where they're at to where they want to be. And in working with the group, sharing back, this is the like story that we're telling. They felt that was accurate, but then they also felt like we needed to go back further in time because it wasn't reflective of everything that they had done, or it wasn't reflective of the fact that they felt like they actually had been doing things and they did have a higher level of support for within their organization to improve organizational culture and climate. They had been doing this work prior to 2020. So they were initially telling a story that it felt very reactive, but then when they were like, actually, we weren't always reactive. We actually do have these things that we want to work towards, and we do have these things that we value independently of what's happening in the world outside of us. We did put effort into wanting to address that. And they were like, how can we get back to that place, but also like challenge ourselves to like be sustained at a level that's higher than we were before. And so that was helpful, which seems like a minor shift in like when you're starting and how you're like the overall story, but it was really helpful for them to remind themselves that they had done this before. They had that muscle, they had that commitment. It is something that is a part of how they've worked together, and they want to sustain that. They want to get back to what doesn't feel like it's possible right now, but it's a reminder that it was. And in some of the community work that I've done, that's also been a really helpful reflection for folks to think about the fact that the experiences that they have right now, things might have been different before. And so when we're thinking about like what how this is helping us with leaning into that systems approach, it's helping us think about what is a system structure that might be responsible for actually stifling, like if we have had this place where we were doing pretty well, and then we had an increase and there was this decrease, what actually might be like causing us to not be able to sustain our efforts or our interest in this, even if we know that we want to? What might be causing some unintended consequences or some unanticipated backlash to our desire to make some changes that we want to make? And again, that's taking away from like it's shifting our focus from individual actors within a system to thinking about how is a system structured to support us in the goals that we actually want to realize, and how can we make sure that we are anticipating some of those challenges, anticipating some of those backlash as we think about what we want to do and sustain in the future. And so again, this encourages us to seek to understand the big picture, and also it allows us to consider how the mental models that we hold are affecting our expectations of the current reality and the future. And again, as I said before, we're all affected by like the systems around us. And so some of the things that I work with a lot with our students in particular in that class is, even if we are really interested in advancing equity, sometimes we recognize that some of the like belief systems that are responsible for like reproducing and maintaining inequities, we also may be unintentionally holding on to. And that might limit our ability to imagine what could be possible, or what could change look like, what would a reality look like if we're not having to deal with some of the challenges that we're dealing with. And so this can be a really helpful reflection tool for allowing us to think about that. And it also can be really helpful for allowing us to think about like whose story is being centered in the story that we're telling. And so part of what this looks like for me is, so like, again, when we're setting the time horizon for like developing our behavior over time graph, again, that's setting the foundation for the story that we're telling. And it's important to think about what boundaries are we putting on it? When are we starting this story? When are we ending this story? And who benefits from the way we're starting and ending this story? Is the story reflective of experiences of everyone that we're interested in understanding their experiences, or for some? And so what are some of the limits? It's really important to wrestle with that. And a lot of times that's what I wrestle with the students in my class, is thinking about how do we encompass things like patriarchy or racism that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. How do we like put some boundaries on that? Because it's important for us to, again, understand the accumulations, how it's built up over time. But we know that we also can't be responsible for things that happened 200 years ago. So how do we account for that in how we're putting boundaries on the story that we're telling right now? Additionally, it allows us to consider, when we think about that time horizon in particular, how we are honoring or considering patterns of resistance, because people who have been the targets or on the like receiving end of systems of oppression, they have resisted, they have pushed back, they have found alternative ways. So are we telling stories that are fully capturing those experiences? Are we focusing on like one perspective that is typically of the dominant group and how we're defining this problem, how we're telling the story? Because again, if we think about what are those patterns of resistance, how are they showing up? That again allows us to think about what aspect of the system is suppressing those patterns of resistance, or those desires that were within the system to actually not experience harm, because that does exist. And if we're not telling that story, then we aren't able to really surface that, right? So it's important to think about that. And our time horizon is one way we can do that. And even how we name our variables, how we name the title of what we're trying to focus on, that's another way that we can consider how is it reflective of patterns of resistance. And also, again, like that mental model that we hold around what the future could look like, how is it like allowing us to imagine realities that are completely void of some of the inequities? Are we like repackaging them in different ways? And then I think one of the most important things is that it can allow us to think about, if we have that shared vision of where we go, is the system that we're in, the way that it's designed, does it actually support the ability for that to be realized? Or do we actually need to fundamentally change something about the system so that that structure, so that goal, that hoped for line is actually sustained? Because there might be some things that need to go about the system that's really strong, that is preventing that sustaining of the goal that we want to have. So that could be one of the ways that we think about that transformation of the system structure, what needs to go, what needs to be trimmed, if we have a clear sense of where we want to go. So I'm going to stop here. And I would like to hear from you all. What are some of your reflections? What are some of the questions that you have? What are some things that you're chewing on? Not just from that last example, but from any of the examples that we've covered with our time together today.
I want to say thank you, Melanie. Really impressive work and a very beautifully simple, clean, elegant presentation. I have a tendency to put a little more, too many things on a slide at one time. So kudos to you. And
Thank you.
that some of the elements that you brought forward around the storytelling aspect of the behavior over time graphs, I thought it was really lovely how you started with where are we now? Think back. Can you just think back? You don't have to have all the data. It's like the lived experiences of those participants can tell you stuff. You don't have to have the data. And oftentimes we depend so much on data that we lose the human aspect of the experience. And so I thought that that was a beautiful, simple way to ask the question to tell the story. And then what do you want to have happen? And the aspect of the white faces getting sad when the marginalized groups started gaining on them. It's like, oh, they're gaining on it. That whole imagery was really powerful. And so I just wanted to call out my appreciation for that.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. Any other questions or reflections from folks?
I had a question, Melanie. It seems like this would lend itself to folks being able to engage in identifying what is, maybe even if they're entering with different like backgrounds or lengths of practice in their own racial identity work. I was like reflecting that that might be a strength of that. Do you find that to be true, or do you feel like it's still helpful for folks to have some level of like basic awareness around racial equity principles before engaging?
Yeah, I always think it's helpful to have like systems thinking work when especially it's focused on equity, also have other supportive tools as well. So this can be helpful for when we're trying to get those, build awareness of some of the things that people may not be aware of yet. I've worked with some like hospitals, for example, or healthcare systems where they haven't tracked some of the racial disparities, but they know they exist. And so it can be really valuable to have some time to build a shared sense together of what some of the stories are. And then we can unpack them and understand why some of the disparities might exist. So some of the like awareness raising of those topics is implied and built upon as we continue to like refine those things, because it is true, just because we use the tool, it doesn't necessarily automatically make someone have like a deep understanding or a really strong political analysis. You get out of the tool like the reflection that what you hold in your own mental model. And so using it as a way for us to negotiate how we're understanding things, how can we start to bring in other perspectives, what are we willing to add to our mental models? That's where the tools have been really helpful for creating somewhat of a safer space for folks to explore around that as they're doing that racial identity development work. Does that answer your question, Allison? Okay.
When working with groups or teams, perhaps, I like to do some of this behavior over time initial work with a series of small groups so that they themselves are generating different perspectives on things. It's not me telling them, that it could be different. And then they get to look at each other and try to sort out, well, how come you see it this way and we see it this way? And it's, that it's a good learning process, I think, and the systems tools are so helpful in that.
Yes, and I've done a lot of dialogue work, and that's a nice complement to that. It's a way for people to get a like visually to see that, oh, we all have different experiences, and then having that space to really listen to and honor those different stories. And like Alice, like I think it was Judy that mentioned being able to get in touch with the human element, the human side of it. That is also a nice complement to align in a way. And so I know we're at time, so I'll hand it back over to
Well,
Jeff. Close us
you
out.
mentioned that you've done a lot of dialogue work, and if I could ask you, Melanie, to share your screen and show, bless you, dear. Next month's session is going to be facilitated by Melanie again with our colleague and her good friend, Alexandria Drea Cedar. And their topic next month is going to be using the ladder of inference to navigate hard conversations. We all have to have hard conversations, whether it's in our work life, our personal lives, whatever it is. But Melanie and Alexandria, are going to focus on using the ladder of inference when you have to face into those hard conversations. And so that's going to be next month's Open Studio. And I just want to, for all of our Water Center colleagues and all of you, again, thank Melanie so much. She was talking fast, she was putting a lot out there, because think about what she said in the beginning. She does weekend-long courses. She does lots of community work where she uses all of her skills and experience to do this work, and she was jamming it in there in an hour for you folks. So yes, look at all the hand claps there, Melanie. And when we get finished here, Melanie will have a chance to read all the comments and the questions in chat. I'm sorry she didn't get to do that while we were going along, but she had so much to share with you. So thank you, Melanie, and thank all of you once again for coming and making this such a rich exchange. And I know that you were responding to each other in chat, and that's what makes this such an open studio. You make it an open studio. So thank you all for being here, and we hope we get to see you next month again with Melanie and Drea for the Using the Ladder for Hard Conversations. So hope to see you again next month. All right, and you can go and register for that now. The registration is already open on the website. So see you next month. Thanks for being here now. Okay, bye-bye.